Welcome back. Now, the rand initially strengthened following the Sarb's decision to keep interest rates unchanged yesterday. However, those gains fell off, with the local unit crossing that 19 rand mark to the dollar at one point today. Joining me now to make sense of the moves playing out in the currency scene is Forex structurer at RMB, Rayno Nigrini. Rayno, thanks so much for joining us today. Now, as mentioned, rand ending off the day particularly strong yesterday against rather major currencies. But today what we're seeing is kind of a reversal of that strength we saw. It was pretty short-lived, right?
It was short-lived, and I think it's because we were kind of looking at the Sarb decision in isolation. But then when you look at today, what kind of happened and the figures that we were expecting out of the US, you almost have to look at that global picture again and see, right, let's not look at the rand alone. Let's see what the rest of the world is doing. And the dollar strengthened phenomenally today quite a bit. So you saw it strengthening against the euro, you saw it strengthening against the pound across all the major currencies and so on. And obviously the rand suffers as a result as well. It strengthened to a point that dollar rand reached about 19.10, so rand quite weak. That was the lowest point or the weakest point for us on the day. We managed to recoup some of that, so we're back at the 19 level again, which is a little bit better than what we were earlier. And this is kind of off the back of the figures that we've seen, the PCE figures and the GDP figures released from the US. Strong GDP figures coming out at 3.4% versus 3.2% expectation, as well as personal consumption expenditure in the US coming out at 3.3% up versus 3%, continue to tell that story that the US economy is not slowing down. It's continuing to be robust, and I think that really bodes well for the global economy as a whole to say that, you know what, if the US is recovering from what we thought was going to be quite a bad recession and it turned out that we would manage to miss it, maybe the rest of the world will be all right. And I think that's what led to that risk-on behavior in the second session of the afternoon.
I want to talk about the hawkishness that we've been seeing from both the Sarb and the Fed. So yes, it isn't just a Sarb story, but we have to also look at things in context and look at the global picture itself. Yesterday, we also saw the Fed officials warning of higher interest rates for longer. And in terms of the rand's performance, it makes me think, did the hawkish Fed trump the hawkish Sarb?
Yeah, it's always one of these decisions. Which reserve bank is bigger than the other, you know? I think we're a small fish in that pond if we're going up against the Fed. But it's exactly that. If the Fed is saying we're higher for longer, higher for how much longer? And if the Sarb is saying higher for longer, how much longer? So if you break down our inflation and where we are, so yes, the Sarb was quite hawkish and they say higher for longer rates. And that's because they're now viewing the end of year inflation to be closer to about 5.1% versus the expectation of 5% that they had previously. Now, if you say, okay, that means that maybe the rate cut could be pushed out, maybe it doesn't happen in July, maybe it happens later. You also need to think about what is driving inflation in South Africa. And a lot of that is probably coming through as a result of increased fuel prices, as a result of the oil price and as a result of dollar rand weakening and so on, and isn't really as a result of consumption expenditure by consumers. If it was as a result of consumption expenditure by consumers and so on, then a higher for longer the interest rate might make sense. But if keeping the interest rates high for longer doesn't really stop us from spending because we can't spend anyway, that reprieve of lower interest rates in order to boost growth might be more important than trying to combat that inflation. I think that's the tough piece. And then on the same token, the Fed as well, they're saying higher for longer. And it also makes sense because their economy is still growing, consumption expenditure is up. So it makes sense that they'd be higher for longer because consumption expenditure is still increasing, even though their rates are still quite high. So both banks coming out with the same tone makes sense, but each in their own different circumstances.
You know what, I'm hoping for that dovish tone soon. I want some relief for all South African consumers.
You and me both.
And consumers across the globe. Now let's get back to those movements. It seems like the downward movements in the rand are quite deeper than the gains we see that have been a bit more shallower. Does this just underpin the risk-off environment or sentiment rather on emerging market currencies?
Look, generally emerging market currencies, and in particular the rand, are one of those that always kind of weaken very quickly and then strengthen quite slowly. A colleague of mine likes to joke and say that the bull walks up the stairs and the bear jumps out the window. So the bear's going to really, the weakening is quite quick, and the bull kind of climbing the stairs slowly is going to take quite slowly. So it's a slow recovery versus that very quick, sudden move on the weaker side. So that's generally the sentiment that we've seen on dollar rand almost since the existence of the rand, I guess.
Literally.
So it's really not surprising to see that kind of behavior even still. But what we are seeing quite now is those moves are not as exasperated. We're almost seeing the rand come into this sort of wedge pattern. And that's a technical analysis kind of formation that we're seeing on dollar rand, where you've got a trend line. I'm going to try to visualize it on the top coming through as well as on the bottom, and it's wedging the rand between these 2 points. And once we reach the breakout on this point, and generally a breakout can occur anywhere from 2/3 after that wedge, that move can either be a sharp move weaker or a sharp move stronger. And coincidentally, that could line up with the elections coming in May and what happens just after that. So it's going to be very, very, very interesting going into May, seeing this wedge formation happening and seeing which way we're going to break out. Are we going to break out stronger? Are we going to break out weaker? Time will tell, I guess.
And that would have brought me to my next question, with the next risk event being the elections in May. You're right, it'll be quite interesting to see how the rand moves moving forward. Rayno, thank you so much for joining us today. That was Forex structurer at RMB, Rayno Nigrini.